Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most infamous queens from the High Middle Ages. In her life, she was both the Queen of France and England, was involved with both the Second and Third Crusades, had two sons who became kings, and was a cunning politician in a time where women were not allowed to be involved in politics. Chroniclers describe her as an extremely bright, confident, charismatic, and beautiful woman. She had an uncanny ability to persuade the powerful men around her into doing her bidding, and in doing this, she amassed an insane amount of power for herself and for her family. She very much has the energy of a Game of Thrones character come to life, to be honest. In this video, we're going to take a journey through Eleanor's roller coaster of a life, touching on a number of historical events that exemplify how politically important she was to this time period. This is not an exhaustive list of all of Eleanor's political accomplishments because her life was very long and very busy, but we will talk about many of her greatest moments. She was also an incredibly scandalous and polarizing figure, with some chroniclers of her time accusing her of being provocative, devilish, and unladylike, and with others characterizing her as romantic, fierce, this Amazonian warrior queen. I've done my best to parse through the myths about her that had no supporting evidence in order to retell her story as honestly as I can, because it really doesn't need sprucing up. Eleanor's story was one of wealth, power, adventure, war, and rebellion. So let's get started. Let me give you the lay of the land. Eleanor's story takes place in Europe during the 12th century, primarily in France and England. France at the time was divvied up between rulers. There was the Domaine Royal, ruled by the King of France, which consisted of the areas around Paris, Bourges, and Sens. In addition to the Domaine Royal, there were the duchies, so the Duchy of Normandy, the Duchy of Brittany, the Duchy of Aquitaine, and so on. And there were also the counties of Toulouse, Maine, Touraine, Vermandois, Anjou, Poitou, and Champagne. The King of France had little control over these regions, and they were governed primarily by their respective dukes, duchesses, and counts. During this period, the House of Poitiers governed the Duchy of Aquitaine, as well as the County of Poitou. This duchy encompassed over a quarter of the landmass of modern-day France. The Poitiers dynasty was powerful, wealthy, and well known for its appreciation of art and literature. In fact, William IX, the Duke of Aquitaine between 1086 and 1127, was the earliest troubadour in medieval history whose poetic works are still in existence, as well as being a crusader and a notorious womanizer. William IX's granddaughter was Eleanor of Aquitaine, born in or around 1122 in the city of Poitiers. Born wealthy, Eleanor received the greatest education money could buy, and in addition to her formal education, Eleanor's family taught her of the accomplishments of her noble ancestors, including the ambitious women of the family who had significant political influence throughout the house's history. Eleanor was the eldest daughter of William X, with a younger brother, William, and a younger sister, Petronilla. Her brother, William, passed away at the age of 4, and Eleanor became heir to the duchy at the age of 8 years old. Eleanor's mother passed away later that same year. In preparation for his daughter to inherit the family land and legacy, Eleanor's father, William X, gathered his noblemen and had them swear allegiance to Eleanor. He also made arrangements to place Eleanor under the protection of the King of France, Louis VI, should he, William, pass away. And pass away he did. In 1137, William X died. Eleanor inherited the massive duchy at about 15 years old, making her the hottest bachelorette in all of Europe. Not long after William X's death, French King Louis VI's health began to decline as he contracted dysentery. Eager to gain power over Eleanor's land, Louis VI sent his son and heir, Louis VII, to Aquitaine to marry Eleanor. They married on the 25th of July, 1137. Fun fact about this wedding, by the way, after they were married, Eleanor gifted her husband a fancy vase that her grandfather, the troubadour, was given by a Muslim ally during the Crusade of 1101, and the vase still exists. You can visit it in the Louvre. Shortly after their wedding, Eleanor and Louis VII headed to Poitiers to be confirmed as the Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine. Just a week after they were married, Louis VI died of his condition, making Eleanor and Louis VII the new Queen and King of France. The two newlyweds immediately headed to Paris where they were crowned King and Queen. It's a busy week. In the early years of their marriage, Louis VII was completely enamored with Eleanor. Chronicler John of Salisbury described Louis as loving Eleanor almost beyond reason. Louis's fondness for Eleanor would become one of her handiest political tools, and she used her influence over him to advance her own political aims. A prime example of this was in 1141, when Louis attempted to conquer Toulouse. Eleanor claimed to have a hereditary right to rule Toulouse, as her grandmother, Philippa, had been countess, and she persuaded Louis to attempt to take the city. This was a very ambitious mission, as Toulouse was strongly fortified, and Louis ultimately failed to take it. But this action still shows us just how far Louis was willing to go for Eleanor, and how ambitious Eleanor was. Around the same time, circa 1142, Petronilla, Eleanor's sister, met Count Raoul of Vermandois and decided that she wanted to marry him, despite the fact that he was already married to the Countess of Champagne. Naturally, Eleanor stepped in, worked her magic on her husband, and persuaded Louis to have Raoul's marriage annulled so that he could marry Petronilla instead. This came with some big consequences. The annulment really angered the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Innocent II, so much so that he wanted to excommunicate Petronilla and Raoul. Champagne sided with the Pope in this decision, and in retaliation, Louis VII waged a 2-year war against Champagne, during which he burned down their capital city, killing over 1,000 people in the fire. The royal army took Champagne, but peace was eventually brokered when an abbot convinced Eleanor to stop influencing her husband in a negative way. Eventually they backed off, and Petronilla and Raoul remained excommunicated until the Pope's death in 1144. Now, Louis VII was an extremely religious man, and he was completely wrought with guilt after burning the civilians of Champagne. So when Pope Eugenius III approached Louis, calling him to initiate a crusade against Turkish Muslim forces, he readily accepted, wanting to redeem himself in the eyes of the church. Louis declared the start of the Second Crusade on Christmas of 1145, and Eleanor was not about to miss out on this action. When Louis set sail for the Middle East, Eleanor took the cross as well, embarking on an adventure through Constantinople, Anatolia, and Jerusalem. Throughout the crusade, the French faced attacks from the Turks that were more strategic and cohesive than that of their own, and the Second Crusade was ultimately a failure for the Crusaders. The decisions Louis made throughout made Eleanor begin to question his capabilities as a leader, and she began to consider seeking political partnership elsewhere. Beyond this, in their 15 years of marriage, the couple had only had 2 daughters, failing to produce any male children to inherit the French crown. For these reasons, in March of 1152, Eleanor and Louis VII's marriage was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. Once again, Eleanor was a single woman, and all the noblemen of the region wanted to marry her, whether she consented or not. After the annulment of her marriage, Eleanor returned to her lands in Poitiers, and in her journey, 2 different nobles attempted to abduct her. She narrowly escaped both times, but Eleanor knew that it wasn't safe for her to be without a husband, so she immediately began writing to her new love interest to arrange a marriage. So you may find yourself asking, who can you even marry who has more power than the King of France? How about Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, as well as heir to the throne of England? And that's exactly what Eleanor did. 8 weeks after her first marriage was annulled, Eleanor and Henry were married. Eleanor gave birth to their firstborn son William a year later, and they would go on to have 8 children over the course of 20 years, 5 boys and 3 girls. 2 years after their marriage, they were crowned King and Queen of England in 1154. Following their marriage, King Henry II possessed the titles of Count of Poitiers and Duke of Aquitaine, meaning Eleanor could no longer govern her land without her husband's consent, and while she maintained much authority over Aquitaine, Henry kept control over the military and income of the duchy. In addition to her responsibilities in Aquitaine, Eleanor did act as regent when Henry left the English kingdom, which was fairly often. Throughout their marriage, Henry was quite publicly unfaithful to her, having several extramarital affairs and producing several illegitimate children. Eleanor turned a blind eye to these affairs, as this behavior was common of noblemen for the time, though she was disillusioned with her marriage. In or around 1170, Eleanor left England to return to Poitiers. By this point, Eleanor had lost much of her political influence. She had resumed her position as Duchess of Aquitaine, but King Henry continuously tried to undermine her authority. However, she was close with her sons, who all had fancy titles but who had not been given any practical power from their father. As their sons grew older, they began seeking more autonomy over their inheritances. This eventually led to the Great Rebellion of 1133 to 1134, in which 3 of King Henry's sons and Eleanor, his wife, revolted against the crown. It was pretty common for sons of kings to squabble with their fathers, but a queen rebelling against her own king was unheard of. But more control for her sons meant more control for Eleanor because she'd be able to influence their decisions, so Eleanor hopped on board, encouraging her lords to support the rebellion. Eleanor knew that she wouldn't be safe in Aquitaine when the rebellion began, so she left for Paris, where her sons were planning their strategy with the help of the French king. But while on her way, Eleanor was captured by men sent by King Henry. They brought her back to his castle, where she was imprisoned for betraying him. Throughout the rebellion, castles were besieged, and much of the king's territory was destroyed, but King Henry was relentless in his defense, and the rebellion was unsuccessful. Eventually, the king and his sons reached a peace, but he was not taking any chances with Eleanor. He knew that she posed a threat to his power, so he kept her in captivity until his death 15 years later. While Eleanor was in captivity, her son Henry died of dysentery, and King Henry II died shortly after. Richard I was crowned King of England and freed his mother from captivity immediately. Richard empowered Eleanor to rule England until he was ready to take charge himself. So Eleanor, now 65, was more powerful than ever and was the center of all political matters in her domain. She was truly back with a vengeance. Having had time to reflect on her life in prison, Eleanor had grown to be a wise, insightful, and pious leader, and she used her power to improve the lives of the people in her land. In 1189, after receiving counsel from Eleanor, King Richard embarked on the Third Crusade in an attempt to recapture Jerusalem, which had been taken by the Turks. Though they won several victories throughout the crusade, they didn't recapture Jerusalem, and Richard was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, who he had offended at some point during the crusade. The Roman emperor demanded a huge ransom for Richard's release, which Eleanor, shockingly, managed to raise by taxing her people as well as extracting wealth from churches. And Richard was freed by 1193. In 1194, Richard regained his power in England, and Eleanor withdrew from public affairs. But her break from the wild world of European politics was short-lived, as Richard died in 1199 after being shot with a crossbow, and Eleanor reassumed the responsibilities of carrying on the Plantagenet legacy as John was crowned king. During this time, she was as energetic and politically savvy as ever, despite being 77 years old, in the 12th century. Then in 1202, war broke out between King John and King Philip II of France. During the war, Arthur of Brittany invaded Poitiers with the support of King Philip. Furious, Eleanor headed to Poitiers to stop the advance, accompanied with military escorts. While she had stopped at the castle of Mirabel near Poitiers, Arthur of Brittany learned of her whereabouts and sieged the castle in an attempt to capture Eleanor. As her men defended the castle, Eleanor managed to smuggle out a letter to John requesting help. King John immediately marched to the castle, caught the besiegers off guard, and overcame them, resulting in the greatest military victory of his reign. And with that one final victory, after a long, long life of amassing power for herself and her family, in 1204, Eleanor became a nun for the rest of her days, until she died at the age of 82. Good job, Eleanor. She had a good run. So to summarize the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, she was a remarkable figure who refused to let the social norms of her time constrain her ambitiousness. She took every opportunity she saw to advance her political aims, and eventually grew to be a good and wise ruler at an age that most people at the time never lived to see. Though we unfortunately didn't get the chance to cover it today, she also had a significant influence on art and poetry throughout her life and contributed greatly to the artistic culture of her domain. Despite the rumors that flurried her at the time and the speculation that surrounds her to this day, Eleanor maintained a laser-like focus on her goals while making her way through the tumultuous life that she was born into. And that is the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess, Queen, Mother, Crusader, and Rebel. Thank you for listening.